Hello, my name is Evan Raskob, and I will be reviewing portfolios today. I am a lecturer at Goldsmiths University in London. I work in interaction, physical computing, and interactive design. I've also taught at the Royal College of Art in London for a few years as the first-year tutor. So I was responsible for quite a bit of applications and looking through portfolios for prospective students. So I have the pleasure of looking through this portfolio today, and I'm going to try and add some helpful advice to help this get refined. This is a really visually rich portfolio, and there's some really nice, strong images in it. I'm just going to give some explanations of different ways you can improve and different things to look out for. First off, this project is quite bold. The red color, the cyberbullying, it's quite a statement to make. I think the graphics are really kind of draw you in, and it's a really interesting layout. It's a bit experimental in the way that it adds all these little error boxes and also the text. So there's a couple things though that, from a portfolio standpoint, that I think maybe could be looked at. First is that the text over here is quite small. And when you're reading portfolios, usually the tutors go through quite quickly. So it's good to have things highlighted. So if it would be really nice to know your role in the project straight away in maybe some bigger letters. Off to the side here can be a little difficult to see. The first thing that really draws the eye here is the cyberbullying. This part over here. It's bold, it's white, it draws us straight in. So I want you to really consider what the first thing is that we should be looking at, and how you can get some credit for that as well. Moving on. In this next one, this is a really interesting experimental layout, first off. I like these different bits of graphics here. It makes it very interesting. Again, I think it suffers from a bit too much text, and text that's a bit small. So a lot of times if people are looking at these, they may be looking at them on the screen, they may be looking at them in a small window on the screen. So stretching really wide with small text can be quite difficult sometimes for people to look at. So when you do this, think about readability, think about layout, think about making your text and your images bold so they can stand out. I don't mean bold in the sense of font, but bold in the sense of larger, the sense of wider, the sense of maybe having more space around them on the screen. This is a really interesting way to lay out different graphs. I don't think I've really seen that, but I would like to see that. If these are important graphs, I'd really like to see them separately so I could really understand what's actually happening inside these and what research was done. This next slide's really interesting. There's a lot of good visual imagery here. There's some of these mannequins are really interesting in the way that they're so big. I can really see detail and texture on this. It's much more difficult in these smaller pictures here. I understand this is to show process, which is interesting. I like how the ribbons are tracing through the different steps that you've made. But at the same time in this work, it's hard to get a sense of all the things that have been done. So maybe some sort of pop-out or some other way of highlighting the different pieces that have been worked on and what the role is that this student took in making them would be really helpful for the tutors. For the storyboard, these images are really nicely drawn, but it's a bit difficult to read because it has a very non-standard way of reading. In English, usually we read from the left to the right. So to have something that goes from the top down and then back up again, and then the top down and then back up again, is difficult to understand. And there's no numbers in this, which may have been helpful. Also, these little arrows are a nice touch to help us know which way we go, but still it's difficult to get a sense of what's happening here. This may be a cultural thing, because people read images and they read text in different directions depending on what culture they're from. But in the West, we tend to read from left to right. So if your audience is in the West, you might want to consider your storyboard moving from left to right and then left to right again. Now this bit I find interesting as somebody who teaches electronics, because there's a device and there's some interaction inside this. And again, I wish these images were a bit bigger, because there's a lot going on inside these images, and it's hard to see what's actually happening here. I can zoom in on the screen, but when I'm reviewing this portfolio as a tutor, I'm not always able to zoom in on these screens, so they can be difficult to read. I do like some of these details, like this shot here. This image of showing the motor and the wiring is interesting because it shows me process and it shows me what's starting to happen. There's some nice text on top here that talks about the steering gear, and about how the keyboard is twitching the wool. The storyboard is also more helpful here. You can see that it goes from left to right in this example, which is easier for me to read. And I really get a sense of what's happening with the unraveling towards this quite violent end over here. In terms of the text, there's a bit going on that really, it could be helpful to change some of the formats here. So if we look down at the bottom, it looks like text is right justified, so it's moved towards the right. I think I would really like to see that more like this text on the top, which is left justified. That's a bit more of a natural way to read when you're a native English speaker, and the same at the bottom on the right. Because we read from right to left, it's easier to have text left justified. It's less work for the eye to come back to that margin. Okay, this is quite a strong image, and an interesting one to start off. So I'm really interested in what's going to happen in this part of the portfolio. It's a very bold image. There's lots of texture. I can see some process. I can see some evidence of some hands-on making. So this is interesting. So again, there's a really, there's some really artistic, I would say, graphic design going on here, and it's interesting in the way that these different boxes connect together by lines. It really reminds me of programming in a way. And that's interesting. I mean, that's quite a nice visual style. Sometimes, though, we can get a little too fancy, and not always sure if that's helpful sometimes on these layouts, because you really want to let your work do the talking and not this extra graphic design. That's not as important to showing the things that you've done. So this record of headaches is pretty fascinating. I think this could really be seen on its own. There's some other projects where people self-studied how they get headaches, or they self-studied their biometric data, and then they've presented that in interesting graphics. This is definitely in that tradition. Here's another interesting slide. These are quite nice because they show a lot of different process. But again, there's maybe too many things. I mean, we do get a sense that there's a lot of making going on, but I don't think we need to see all these things to understand that. Just a few of these images would be really nice. The one on top, I'm not convinced about, but the ones that maybe like this one over here, or this one down here, that really show hands working on something, that's interesting, and I'd love to see some more explanations of that as well, to see what you're doing and why you're doing it. Okay, sometimes it's not, you don't need to communicate all the things that you've made, you just need to communicate some of the most interesting things. And there's a lot of interesting work over here. I mean, I can see from the different colors, it's very intriguing. And here I think maybe this layout works a bit better, because the different images with this data graph on top are really interesting. I think when they're all side by side, we start to get a sense of what this means. So in this case, more it can be a bit helpful because it shows a collection of different objects. Okay, and then there's some code inside here. I'm also not a fan of showing code. Usually, if I wanted to show some code, I would put a link to that code. I have to say this is not particularly difficult or interesting code. It does something, but it's pretty standard in the way that it works. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't useful for the project. I'm sure it was very useful and very effective, but at the same time, it's probably not the thing that you want to show the different tutors. Also, the wiring diagram, again, if you're going to show technical diagrams, you really should show them bigger so we can understand what's inside that technical diagram. This one's just too small to read, so it's hard to get really a sense of what's actually happening in it. Okay, other than that, I think it's interesting. Again, there's a lot going on. I mean, at least, you know, I would be interested to ask some more questions after looking at this. Okay, and here's some more lovely shots. These are really nice detailed shots. Really nice use of color, of form, very interesting shapes. Okay, and I think I'm going to leave it there with the critique. I think it's sort of what I've said before really applies towards the rest of these projects. They're very visually interesting, and there's some really interesting graphic design going on here with the different pipes that link together different aspects. But sometimes it's a bit too fancy for its own good. I think a lot of this would benefit from highlighting different bits of detail and showing it much bigger so we can start to understand what's actually going on. This is just too much information for us to take in, especially in the amount of time people have to actually read a portfolio. But, you know, there's a really nice use of color again and form. So there's a lot to like about this portfolio. So in the end, I think it's some really nice work. But, you know, in future work, again, refining that message and getting it more streamlined and making sure it's more readable for people is an important part of communication. Thank you.